Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we are live taking a look ahead at two games in Detroit against the Pistons. I can't believe we're saying this, importance of those games potentially. Also get Camille's reaction and yours as well as we did this, an instant reaction, but more thoughts on that Pascal Siakam trade and what it means for the East, but the Central Division as a whole. And speaking of trades, we are now under 3 weeks away from the trade deadline. So more of your takes on that. A jam-packed live edition of Locked On Bucks comes up next.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I am Justin Garcia. You can hear me on the Bucks Radio Network and WTMJ here in Milwaukee. Joined as always by Camille Davis. You can also find her on the Technical Foul podcast and the Carry the G in MKE podcast. Still going very strong.
Yes,
Camille, maybe into next week as well. We both thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts and viewable on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by PrizePicks. It is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA, all lowercase, for a first deposit match up to $100. Camille, we have reached the point now where we've circled the game against the Detroit Pistons, or two games against the Pistons, as well. Hopefully this is what the doctor ordered for the Bucks. These are nervous times because, as you and Frank broke down, not the best of times in Cleveland against the Cavaliers. That's putting it mildly. And you're going to see that Cavs team two more times next week, by the way. But now all of a sudden, look, you're still 28-13. It's not as though the Bucks are, man, you got to win. But you don't want to drop one of two games, or God forbid both, to this Pistons team on the heels of a 40-point loss on the road.
You absolutely do not. We've had conversations already about how January has gone for the Milwaukee Bucks after a amazing December where they went, I believe, 11-2. January has not been as favorable for the Bucks. We just talked about the fact that they lost by 40 to Cleveland in Cleveland. Yes, I know Giannis was not playing, but yet and still that does not equate a 40-point L in my book. So now you're coming up against Detroit, a team that just made a trade for really the summer. Like, in my opinion, the trade that the Pistons made, getting rid of Bagley, getting rid of Livers, like, that's to clear up salary space for this summer. Not necessarily sure what free agents they're looking to court this summer, especially with the free agent class dwindling now with Pascal Siakam going to Indiana. And it looks like he might be re-signing there. An extension might come about with that trade. So you're looking at a team here that lost a rotational piece in Bagley for sure. Livers also got some playing time as well. But now it's a Detroit team that's, listen, the players themselves are going to keep playing. There's no doubt about that. But where the Bucks are looking to be at the end of the season and where the Pistons are looking to be, this is a game in which you expect the Bucks to win it. And if they don't, I made a joke to Frank after we finished recording. I said, Bucks Twitter will go up in flames if the Bucks somehow lose one of these two games in Detroit.
Look, not only should you win these games, you should win them big. That we're at the midpoint of the season. And again, there is no magic number of, well, once you're X amount of games in, things turn around and they're better. But we're at that point where this isn't we're still figuring out the offense. You need to blow out the Pistons with the way that they're playing. Now, you mentioned the absences that they've had with that trade. Marvin Bagley III on paper is a big absence, but the reality of what he was giving you was not. They do have a big boost in the fact that apparently Monty Williams was the last one to realize that Jaden Ivey is a rotational piece that should be playing, and he's been playing better of late, but amazing it took Monty Williams 40 games and meeting with basketball ops to be told, hey, you should probably play this guy, and maybe not so much Killian Hayes that you keep forcing down our throats.
It's strange that it took this long to figure that out, given the way that he finished the season last year.
Yeah.
Like, when looking at the Detroit Pistons and that roster, like, of course, you talk about Cade Cunningham, and we know how them losing him last year affected this team. But with him being out, Jaden Ivey took on a bigger role, and he was playing a lot of minutes. And it looked, and within the last season, where coming into this one, where you're like, hey, Ivy and Cunningham, like that could be a pretty nice pairing together. And like you mentioned, it just seemed to have taken Monty some time to figure that out. And again, the guys they brought in, they're vets. They brought guys in on expiring contracts, money that's coming off the books. But at the very least, the theory of what you can get from Gallinari as well as Muscala is that you can get some guys who can stretch the floor. And with Detroit, a big problem for them was their spacing. They just didn't have that many shooters out there. Now, it should be said that those two guys have not shot the ball exceptionally well from three this season, but looking at what they've brought over their career, those are two guys who have been known to stretch the floor. So at least this season, where you're kind of like, well, we know these guys probably aren't long-term pieces, it will be interesting to see if they are getting playing time, how that does open the floor up for a Cade Cunningham or a Jaden Ivey to operate, as well as Asir Thompson.
I think the potentially scary part about playing the Pistons is, number one, this is a Bucks fan base that seems to be pretty vulnerable right now. So you are just looking around waiting for the next bad piece of news to come, it seems like. But also the Pistons are red hot. They have won 2 out of their last 10 games after winning 2 out of their first 31 to start the season. So they've been playing much better. But look, we've had this conversation a number of times this season because, again, it hasn't been a difficult schedule that the Bucks have played, but you need to win these games big. And we understand we're not viewing this as fool's gold of, if you hold the Pistons to 98 points and you win by 30, everything's fixed. But like, it's also what you need to see, that at some point you just got to perform as we expect you to see. And that's what you're expecting against the Pistons, is a double-digit win. And they should not be approaching 120 points offensively with this group.
No, this should be a taking care of business series for the Bucks. It should be one of those series where you're watching it, and I say series, it's a mini series. It's 2 games in Detroit here. And with that, like you said, you expect the Bucks to take care of business. Like, it's expected for them to come out and not necessarily struggle. It's interesting thinking about that, because the conversation that was had around the Jazz loss, where it's like, how do we lose to the Jazz? And now you've seen what the Jazz have been doing, and you're like, okay, well, that loss looks different in context. I don't think there's any way that losses to the Pistons will look different in context if they don't do what they're supposed to do this weekend.
So you're not taking the bait on the 2-8 in their last 10 means they're much
yeah,
better.
that red hot is relative.
No, it's a very tough sell. If look, even if, and again, I hate doing this because as you pointed out, the players are still playing to win, right? Like the organization and the front office may have a different view. Monty Williams, I don't know if you were a Seinfeld fan, he may well be pulling a George Costanza here, where he's just strapped the World Series trophy to the back of his car and doing anything he can to get fired. That's the only thing I can explain with the fact that Monty didn't want to be there to begin with and was open about that. And the revelation of Jaden Ivey, I suppose I can play him. I don't know. Maybe Monty's trying to get fired. Who knows? But not only do you need to win these games, they can't be competitive, right? Like, it's not just, hey, we can't lose. Like, if these are, especially both of them, if these are competitive games where it's going down to the wire, then I think a larger conversation needs to be had if that's the case.
Yeah, and I mean, the first game, because this will be our 3rd time playing Detroit on Saturday. The first game against Detroit, it was close. And during that time period, it was still earlier on in the season. And people were like, hey, this could be a good year for Detroit. The context around the games. Yeah, it was at that point, it was like, okay, here we go. Like, Detroit might be good. The last time we saw Detroit, it was the big blowout where Giannis had his kids on the bench with them. And, it was like, oh, like, the Bucks have handled business so well tonight that Giannis literally has his children on the bench. Like, this was a game where, like, the Bucks looked how you would expect them to look against a team who was on a losing streak like the Pistons were. And now at this point, it's a team that, like I mentioned, it seems as if the front office and those who are making decisions are already looking ahead to the summer, saying like, hey, We know what this season is. Let's clear up some cap space. Let's be flexible in what we can do, whether that's getting new free agents or maybe a salary dump location if we can get additional draft resources for that. So front office is signaling like, hey, this season, it is what it is. But of course, the players are going to come out and play. So if you don't take it seriously and if you don't, respect the game, as you hear often, like the basketball gods are not going to reward that. So again, the Bucks can't take the Pistons lightly, but they need to take care of business in the way that we expect a championship contending team to do.
Yeah, the last time we saw Detroit was the peak of the season to date. Hopefully it's not the peak of the Bucks season, but that was during that 6-game homestand, during the win streak, and during the month of December, where it was, the Bucks. All right, this is, as you mentioned, the metrics and the numbers we saw. They were by the numbers one of the best teams in the league in the month of December, and that was okay. It seems like they've started to turn the corner. So hopefully seeing the Pistons is what triggers that once more for this Bucks team. I mentioned the trade that we saw earlier in the week with Pascal Siakam. We did a live show after that trade as well to just get the instant reaction out there. But I do want to get Camille's feedback on that and her thoughts on what we're seeing for this Central Division and the Eastern Conference as a whole, because there was one big takeaway for me. I want to run it past Camille and then also take a look at what's coming up in less than 3 weeks. I think we're 20 days away now from the upcoming trade deadline here. So we will get into all of that and continue to hear from you guys as well coming up after the break on Locked On Bucks. Well, our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week all season long. Whether you're preparing for a daily draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we are going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So let's see who Josh has picked out for us for this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Player of the Week. And it's really hard not to go with GG Jackson and the story that he has been so far for the Memphis Grizzlies, newly paid as well. They need shot creation. He adds shot creation. He has shown in flashes. He should be someone managers look to grab to see how Memphis deploys this season. Actually, GG Jackson, not paid Vince was. So GG Jackson, though, a big game that he had earlier in the week, and then the interaction that he had as well with Shaquille O'Neal afterwards. So GG Jackson, who I would be targeting this week on the waiver wire. Josh Lloyd from Locked On Fantasy Basketball is going to help you win your fantasy championship. And eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a fit. Same with your vehicle. At eBay Motors, over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof racks, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, it is guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. And plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. And as you watch us here on YouTube, we should also direct you to another channel you can find from Locked On YouTube. It is the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. It's Locked On Sports Today, and it is here for you 24/7, covering the top stories of the day with local experts you've come to expect from Locked On and all the national shows that go into each and every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. I should clean one thing up, Camille. I still stand by that Gigi Williams. Vince is who I'm confusing him with, the newly paid. Yeah. So Memphis, another team, as we transition into the trade deadline, that's going to be an interesting team to keep an eye on as well, because they're in that spot of expectations not meeting where you're at right now. This is arguably the season from hell when you look at the Jaws suspension, injury after injury that they've had. But a lot of people have started to circle the carcass and say, could you get a guy like a Marcus Smart from them? Which, look, it would make a whole lot of sense for the Bucks and a number of other teams. I just don't really get the sense that Memphis is looking to do that they've kind of said, let's just tank the rest of the season. We'll come back with the same group. We'll get a good draft pick as well. And we feel like next year we're going to be in the top of the Western Conference. So I don't know about Marcus Smart for the Bucks, but when we get into this trade for Pascal Siakam, part of it was Bruce Brown. And it is a very interesting move because, number one, the asset management game that the Indiana Pacers played, where you said, we got this cap space. It's kind of similar to what they did with Miles Turner a couple of years ago, too, when they had to spend some money. So they overpaid Miles Turner and front loaded that contract. You basically did the same with Bruce Brown here, where you said, we'll pay him more than maybe what the market rate is. And we have turned that into Pascal Siakam, who I would assume they are going to lock up. But I mention this because I would assume Bruce Brown gets rerouted and moved from Toronto now. Now, he can't be aggregated with another player, but that doesn't seem to be of the concern to the Bucks of, hey, we'll aggregate our own contracts to bring in Bruce Brown. The number isn't quite as large as you would think because of how the contract is structured as well. So it's nowhere near the conversation of, man, did this trade help out a team like we had with the Bucks acquiring Damian Lillard and giving up Drew Holiday? But I do wonder now, you get Pascal Siakam, but is Bruce Brown as a role player the exact type of guy the Bucks, the 76ers, a number of teams say, hey, great, we'll take this guy, and he helps us immensely?
He's already shown the value that he can bring to a championship team, and that's fresh in everyone's memory since Denver just won it last year, and we got to see the role that Bruce Brown played. So there's no doubt that he's going to be somebody that other teams are like, hey, Toronto, are you really trying to keep him there? Are you trying to reroute him? So that's definitely a piece to consider when thinking about this trade as a whole, because it still might shift the landscape in the league in a way that we're not aware of yet. Because Pascal Siakam going to the Pacers was a trade where I had some friends who were like, doesn't move me one way or another. And to me, I'm like, I don't think it puts them into like a championship caliber, tier, but I do think it made the team better. And when you look at the standings, it's all pretty close here in the East at the moment. Like the Bucks have a 4-game lead over the Pacers right now. And we've talked about schedule already. We know that the Bucks have had an easier schedule so far this season. And according to Tankathon, I believe they have the Bucks with like the 8th toughest schedule remaining so far this season. Meanwhile, Indiana has the 25th toughest schedule remaining so far this season. So if you're thinking about it in a thing of like the games, like let's think about the standings for a second here and how that might affect it. Like you might not think that the Pacers are any more scary, although the Bucks did lose the season series already against the Pacers. So what does that mean for the standings? If this trade can help bolster them as they go through an easier end of the season schedule-wise than what they had to start the season, it could really affect the Bucks in that way as well, where you're looking at a 2 seed, but now you might drop down to 3 or 4, which we hope not. But with the way the Bucks have been playing, you add in Siakam into Indiana, which is a fit that I actually very much like for the Pacers. They needed a 4. They tried Obi Toppin there and like the offense, sure, but it just wasn't looking right. You put in Siakam, who can play defense, stretch the floor a bit for you. Him and Halliburton together feels like a pretty interesting pick and roll pairing. And then you also have Turner still. Like, I like what the Pacers have. Again, I don't think they're in a championship tier, but I do think they can win quite a few games here to end the season, which might impact the Bucks when it looked at the standings.
It's funny too. I was just about to bring it up when you mentioned Tankathon, that when you look at, and this is why it gets interesting for the Bucks as we look ahead to the trade deadline and just the second half in general, because you've done a decent job of keeping the pace with the Boston Celtics, though it does kind of feel like this could be the point where you start to lose the rope a little bit as Boston's schedule lightens up quite a bit, and the Bucks, as we've mentioned, it gets much more difficult. But the fascinating part to me is when we look at strength of schedule and you look at who has the easiest path forward from here on out, 29, 28, and 27. In other words, the second, third, and fourth easiest remaining schedules in the league belong to 3 of the teams with the top 4 records in the NBA, in the Celtics, the Timberwolves, and the Oklahoma City Thunder. And 2 of those teams lead their respective conferences. So you could view this and say, well, I don't think we're really going to see any change at the top of either conference in terms of who's currently leading it. And that's kind of where I sit, at least in the East. I don't think the Bucks are going to catch the Celtics. I don't think many of us thought from day one the Bucks would finish with the best record in the East, just given all the change that they were going through and how backloaded that schedule really is. But to me, this really cements it that, man, it's going to be a lot to overcome what Boston has, because it's currently a 4-game gap. You're basically going to have to win both of the remaining games you have against the Celtics. And your schedule gets immensely more difficult. As you mentioned, 8th most difficult remaining schedule in the league. The Bucks average win percentage for opponents is above 500 from here on out. Celtics have one of the easiest schedules. And for a while, the Bucks and Sixers had played a very similar schedule as well, where their to date opponent strength of schedule is almost identical. And that started to separate recently as well. When you look at some of the matchups that Philly has had here, that now all of a sudden Philly's remaining schedule is in the bottom 10 or top 10 in terms of easiest remaining schedule. So that's a team you got to be cautious of. And it makes what the Pacers did even more interesting when you think about what they have left, because that's a team that could be on the move here. And even teams like the Knicks, that if you're the Bucks, 3 is the line that you absolutely cannot drop below, I would think, just in terms of what that's going to mean for your go forward. It would mean you're playing the Celtics in the second round of the playoffs. And look, I've long been an advocate for, you got to beat that team sooner or later. So where it happens, I don't really nitpick that and have I'd rather it happen here, but you'd also like to prolong things if you can. And maybe somebody can take care of the Celtics before you, similar to how we saw the Atlanta Hawks take out the Sixers the year that the Bucks won the championship. But to me, 3 is that line you just can't drop below. And right now you got a decent amount of space there, but it started to shrink, where all of a sudden the gap between you and 3 or you and 4, excuse me, is less than the gap between you and the Boston Celtics. And that team at 4, you play twice next week. So worst case scenario for the Bucks is this becomes really interesting in the span of 10 days.
It really can. And that's part of why this upcoming slate of games, the next 4, are going to be a pivotal point for this Bucks team. Like we mentioned, got to take care of Detroit. Like if we lose those Detroit games, that's a whole different conversation there, just given where this team is and looking at the standings. Like those are wins that you're going to need. We've talked so far this season about, hey, the Bucks are still figuring things out. It's nice that they're figuring it out while they're winning, so that at least in the standings, they're not losing too much ground. But up next, you have the Cavaliers, who haven't had the best health luck so far this season, but have still found ways to be competitive, to be winning. They've been playing really good basketball for the last couple of weeks as well. So that's a team that right now they're playing really good ball. So when you see them again next week, you are going to have to be on top of your game as well. And that's the part that makes me, I don't want to say nervous, but when I'm thinking about this Bucks team and I'm looking at the East, we used to make jokes, years ago, like the Eastern Conference, like the East is weak, so on and so forth. And while you may only peg the Celtics, the 76ers, and the Bucks as the championship teams, quote unquote, in this tier, the Knicks, the Pacers, the Cavaliers, they're not easy outs. Like they're going to make you work for that. So when thinking about the upcoming schedule, what they need to do, you just got to take care of business. And I don't want to look too far ahead and overlook Detroit. And like I mentioned, you get the basketball gods mad at you, wherever the case may be. But it's getting to that time. Like we're approaching All-Star break. We're halfway through the season now. And people are starting to separate themselves. Like you don't have to worry when it comes to the standings so much in the East about the Hornets, the Wizards, and the Pistons. Like those 3 teams, that's not part of the equation at this point. And the Raptors and the Nets and the Hawks, they've kind of been figuring things out. They're kind of floating around right now. We know the Raptors made their trade. We'll see how that works out for them. But everyone else there, the Bulls have been up and down so far. The Magic started really strong. And I mentioned looking at their schedule, like if they got through December and they were still looking like a top 4 team in the East, then the Magic had something well, but they've dropped down to 8 at this point. So again, a team you can't overlook. You don't look at them at the championship team, but they can make it difficult on you. And then you get into your Pacers, your Heat, your Knicks, your Cavaliers. And if you're not playing your A game, and we have seen this Bucks team defensively where you're like, that's not going to cut it. So if they don't get their act together in that way, and they're continuing to make those mistakes, communication breakdowns, not getting back in transition, not boxing out, not getting boards, the very basic fundamentals, you can get beat in those games.
You can, and we've had that conversation over and over. Of I don't want to overlook the opposition, but it's certainly going to be paramount here this weekend when we just went through the two matchups with the Pistons, and then again as we just went through those two games next week are suddenly very big against the Cavaliers. Any divisional game when this division is not for certain at this point either. It's not the Central Division of the past where you knew the Bucks were just going to blow through teams and potentially winning that conference or division by close to 10 games at times. That's not what the Central Division is this year, with the Cavaliers just 3 games back of you and only 2 in the loss column, and the Pacers 4 games back. So that is going to be interesting to keep an eye on moving forward for this team. I do want to get to some other trade chatter as again, we're less than 3 weeks away from the trade deadline. And one other thing to point out about that Bruce Brown move and its potential impact on the Bucks, but more so other teams in the association here. We'll get to that coming up after the break. Well, PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America, and it is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports because it is just you against the numbers. So instead of battling thousands of other players like pros and sharks, all you have to do is just pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and from there, watch the winnings roll in. If you want to play alongside some of PrizePicks' favorite famous players as well, like Meek Mill, Andrew Schultz, you can find those in the community plays under the promos tab of the app and view entries from some of the biggest names in PrizePicks community each week. They even offer a reboot policy, so if your entries can stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if your player exits in the first half and does not return in the second half, that player is rebooted. PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an insurance policy, and you can even combine projections and stats from multiple leagues. It's a league created specifically for combo projections that include 2 or more players from different sports or leagues. For example, you wanted to keep riding the hot hand and combine Jordan Love touchdown passes this weekend and Giannis dunks, and you set that number at 7.5. You can do that as well. It's very easy to play. All you have to do is go to prizepicks.com/lockedonnba and use the code LOCKEDONNBA, and you'll get a first deposit match up to $100. prizepicks.com/lockedonnba, and again, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for that first deposit match up to $100. Camille, I mentioned Bruce Brown and the interest that is certainly going to pick up in him around the league. Again, it's not quite the Drew Holiday sweepstakes, but I think when Drew Holiday got traded, everybody knew, well, he's not staying in Portland. Either another team gets added to this or he'll get rerouted in a separate deal. This is the same all over again with Bruce Brown, because the Raptors, whether or not this is a year or two too late, have finally signaled we are rebuilding, and we recognize we maybe fumbled the bag the last couple of off seasons with what we were doing here. But they would also need to decline his option because it's a team option. And we mentioned what the Pacers did, where they said, we'll pay you a ton of money now. I think everybody raised an eyebrow when they saw what it was, 2 years, $48 million, I think was his deal that he got in the off season. They front loaded it and they made that second year a team option. So whoever has him, and in this case, it's the Raptors, will have to decline that option in order to have their full cap space, which is more than $30 million for Toronto. Now, because of the way that contract is structured, I think it's $22 million that he's on the books for. You would only have to send 14.5, 15 million, something like that you would have to match in a trade for him. for most teams. However, just because of the guarantees, I don't think, and it's a shame we don't have Frank on here, but I'm 98% certain the Bucks are not one of those teams that could only send that limited amount because of their status in the apron. I think all of those teams that you would see, the Bucks, the Celtics, the Suns, they would have to match that full amount. But we know Bruce Brown is going to be moved at some point.
That's what you think, for sure, for sure. And like we mentioned earlier, it's something to keep an eye on. I'm not sure, like you mentioned, if the Bucks can get in on that sweepstakes. And I know, again, we're a few weeks out now from the trade deadline, and we've had conversations about this team and the scheme and the personnel, and if we have the best group of guys to execute the scheme that Griff is looking to run here. Bruce Brown is somebody who definitely fits in to what it looks like the Bucks would be trying to do. And there are some other names out there too that are a little bit cheaper, that I think could make an impact for this Bucks team. Now, again, this is just my little humble opinion here, but I did see recently that, over there in New York, we have Quentin Grimes, who has recently, been made available. He is somebody who has said, like, hey, I'm not happy with my playing time here. That's someone who could be an option given the fact that he's fallen out the rotation with our old friend Dante DiVincenzo going there and Josh Hart going there. So he's not getting too much play time, and the numbers haven't been too great so far this season. But we know he's a 3-and-D guard. Like, that's his prototype here. And although his offensive numbers have fallen this season, the defense has been exactly what you thought that you would get from Quentin Grimes. Like, that's a name out there. I know Matisse Thybulle's name out there where people are thinking of defense and someone who might be able to be gotten. And then I know it's not as, appealing, but someone like a Chris Dunn, where you're like just trying to get some more defense in on the team. Again, these are smaller contracts than a Bruce Brown contract, so you might have a little bit more leeway to make it done outside of the Thibault contract. I believe he's a little bit more expensive, but those are some other guys there who, you might be able to take a look at and say, like, hey, is this somebody who the Bucks could acquire at this trade deadline?
Yeah, Matisse Thybulle's a name that's come up quite a bit, and I even in the chat today, we've seen a number of Bucks fans and viewers pointing out Matisse Thybulle is a guy that they would certainly want. It's been for months now that we've continued to hear that name. We've continued to hear Davion Mitchell's name as well. He's a guy that when you look at the salary, it makes a little more sense. It's more of a, what do you have that you're giving the Sacramento Kings in turn? I think that the two names that pop up the most, I'm not sure what the fit is on the Sacramento Kings there. And you have that asset, which is a relatively good asset that the Bucks have in terms of that second round pick from the Portland Trail Blazers this year. A very, very good move by John Horst to get that included in the Damian Lillard trade. I'm sure proactively knowing we need some other bullets in the chamber. We need some other things that we're going to be able to do. This will be one of them. If they trade Damian Lillard, they're clearly rebuilding. And the fact that the Blazers included that, even as a second-round pick, a little surprising, and a credit to John Horst there, because it's essentially a first-round pick, that it's going to be second or third in the second round there that you have. But that's it, because as we've gone over ad nauseum, you can't trade any first-rounders until, I think, 2031 or 2030. And even your second round picks have started to dry up when you look at the deals that landed PJ Tucker, that landed Jay Crowder last trade deadline. That's 9 picks in 2 of the last 3 years, second round picks that you had shipped out. So that well is starting to run dry as well. And your point about those names of a Matisse Thybulle, about a Davion Mitchell, and Quentin Grimes to a lesser extent, these are maybe the most realistic options for the Bucks. I've talked about this a number of times too, and this, as we've gone over on this show, this is probably the last chance you have to do anything, not even significant, but just moderately significant with the cap situation you're in, and with those dwindling assets that we just pointed to. The only other option is to go nuclear and blow things up.
Yeah, and I don't see that being an option at this point this season. I know the last few weeks haven't been the Bucks basketball that fans or even the players themselves have expected to be playing, but I just don't see that nuclear option being something on the table for this team this year, given the fact that it's Griff's first year. It's a coach that Giannis did want to hire. I think that's something that should be continued to be brought up, that part of Griff being here was, hey, Giannis was like, out of the candidates, like, I really do like what Adrian Griffin brings to the table here. There's been conversation around Chris Middleton's play. I know he played poorly in the last game against the Cavaliers. And I saw Stephen A. Smith at the halftime show was making a big fuss saying Chris Middleton's lost it. And, he's not that good. And I guess if you view the Bucks through that lens, then you would say like, hey, going nuclear isn't a good option for the Bucks. But Chris Middleton had a bad game for sure, but he has not had a bad season for this team. And he's too valuable of a piece to try to trade at this point. So I don't see that happening. Like you mentioned, I think it's going to be around the edges. And unfortunately, like the guys who might be on the move if the Bucks do make a move include a fan favorite in Bobby Portis, Pat Connaughton, maybe Marjan, AJ Green, someone like that would probably have to go out to bring someone else back in. But that nuclear option, I don't see that happening. Not this year, not when they're still second in the East at this point, although it hasn't been a great month. And then you hear things from players in the locker room where it doesn't seem like the locker room has lost faith in what they have going on as well, which is another key component when thinking about the coaching and thinking about what you do at the trade deadline. This is a team of guys who still want to play together. They still believe in one another, and they're going to have an interesting weekend slate coming up here to really put that into effort.
And in terms of as we get set to wrap things up here, so just those three names that we brought up, Matisse Thybulle is making, I think, $10.5 million in Portland. He does have a trade bonus, which the Bucks would be on the hook for. So you would, I believe, have to send out about $12 million in salary to bring him in there. We mentioned Davion Mitchell as well. He's a more affordable asset at about $5 million that he's making, and I believe he's under contract one more year as well. Quentin Grimes is interesting because it's cheap, yeah, and it's quickly that he's fallen out of the favor in the rotation, which is not surprising when we've seen other players exodus there in New York. We know how Tibbs is and the type of player that he likes to coach, but he's cheap, and it's just over $2 million that he's making, and that's another one where you certainly have salaries to match it. It's just, how do we sweeten this? And again, that second round pick from the Portland Trail Blazers, maybe that's the sweetener that you would use, whether or not you would hold out and try to use that to see, can we do something bigger? Who knows? But I do think the Bucks are definitely doing something here because of everything we said. And that nuclear option that I pointed to as well, to me, that's more the offseason. If it's just this didn't work, the only way we can change is maybe we just recoup some of those assets and move on from there. Because once you get to July 1st, when the league year begins, the handcuffs are on the Bucks in terms of that second apron and everything that they're not going to be able to do. So given that and the fact that he has been active traditionally at the deadline, I do expect maybe multiple moves here from John Horst, knowing this is the last chance that we have. And that's an easier sell in ownership too, of look, we're not going to be able to do this stuff in the next 2 years, 3 years because of that second apron. So this is really it. So I do expect them to be active, and I expect to have us with a lot of updates moving into that trade deadline. We'll be back this weekend to recap, hopefully a win against the Detroit Pistons. It'll be a win against the Pistons. If not, that is a conversation I don't know if we're ready to have here of what that means. And we didn't get to it on today's show, but I do want to get to, and hopefully we see some change against the Pistons. Some of the numbers we've talked about defensively and some of the things that Frank Madden pointed out on Twitter as well as to why we have seen these issues with the defense. Hopefully we see that corrected this weekend, and we can get into that conversation in a couple of days here at a post-game show on Monday as well. A post-game show on Tuesday for game 2 against I'm thrown off by the schedule we've had these last 2 weeks here. And the fact that the Packers are still playing in mid to late January, something we didn't expect 2 months ago. So strange times indeed. We'll be back with the weekend show and some more recaps of the games next week as well. Thanks to everybody for tuning in once again to the live show. Talk to you in a couple of days on Locked On Bucks.